So hi everyone again. Good evening. My name is Roxy and I'm the Visitor Experience and Outreach Coordinator at the Lewis Latimer House Museum. For those who cannot see me, I am an East Asian woman with short brown hair wearing a blue and white striped shirt. I'm joined tonight by our facilitator of the ReVer Lab series, Sherese Francis. Before we start tonight's program, I want to acknowledge that the Lewis Latimer House Museum is located in Flushing, Queens, and is on the land of the Matinecock, who are of the Algonquin people. They are the original occupants of northwestern Long Island. Among the first to feel the impact of European settlement and seldom mentioned after the colonial period, the Matinecocks experienced profound changes after the 17th century. To learn more about the Matinecock Nation, we encourage you to visit their website and Facebook page that I'll now share in the chat. So just give a minute to do that and feel free to take a look on those resources. I would also like to take a minute to introduce our museum. For those who have not visited us, the Lewis Latimer House Museum was the home to Black inventor Lewis Latimer from 1903 to 1928 in Flushing, Queens. Lewis Latimer contributed to modern technologies, including the early elevator system, bathrooms and railroad carts, the telephone, and most notably, the carbon filament light bulb. So the background behind me is actually how the museum looks like on a day in spring. I believe it is from 2 years before, but yeah, we hope that if you haven't visited us, that you have a chance to do so, since we have folks that may not be located in New York City. So we are here tonight for the third session of the ReVer Lab series as part of Sherese Francis' poetic project KwaNTum. ReVer Lab is an invitation for participants to be a part of her research process over the course of several lab series sessions and an open performance/collection. KwaNTum is a poetic project exploring concepts of knowledge and knowledge making through Afro-diasporic-centered research, looking at various Black and Afro-diasporic thinkers, writers, poets, and artists, as well as themes from STEM. Sherese will present research findings and works in process and invite participants to create their own response pieces. Our program tonight is made possible by the literary grant with the New York State Council on the Arts and Queens Council on the Arts. This is one of several sessions of the series, as you all may know. There will be an in-person performance gathering for December, which participants such as yourself are invited to take part in with your own writings. This workshop is also call and response, meaning you can respond either through writing. This could be during Sherese's presentation or after. You could also respond by participating in December's in-person performance. So yeah, we will be taking time to do, discuss further after Sherese's presentation. We also want to acknowledge that, if you don't feel comfortable to speak, you want to, process in silence, that is also a very valid response. So, please don't feel pressure to say things, feel free to always comment in the chat if you would like. We hope this resonates, and I will now introduce our facilitator, Sherese. So Sherese Francis is an alchemist of the I-Magination and expresses herself through poetry, interdisciplinary arts, workshop facilitation, editing, and literary curation. Her work takes inspiration from her Afro-Caribbean heritage, Barbados and Dominica, and studies in Afrofuturism and Black speculative arts, mythology, and etymology. Some of her work has been published in Furious Flower, Obsidian, Apex Magazine, Bouquet, African Voices, and Newtown Literary. Additionally, Sherese has published 3 chapbooks: Lucy's Bone Scrolls, Variations on Settling Seedling, and Recycling on a why that rules over my sacred light. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Sherese.
Thank you, Roxy, and thank you to you all for joining tonight. As Roxy mentioned, I will be sharing my findings of my research, and I invite you all to share in the chat or to write your own reflections in your own journal, laptop, whatever feels comfortable for you. And tonight we'll be exploring a little bit more about expanding the idea of common sense to community sense. And we'll be thinking about that through different figures like Sylvia Wynter and her idea of biomythic creatures. So that being said, and if you can't see me, I'm a Black person with dreadlocks. I have a red shirt on and glasses, and I have a sunset in my background as well. Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, I hope you all can see it. So, welcome to Reverberations Lab, the third session, and I would like to begin with a little poem that I wrote to think about what we're going to be talking about today. It's called Sapient Sampling. Have you had enough? Want to taste? You got to smell the funk first. So this I wrote in thinking about what does it mean for us to be sapient creatures as we call ourselves. And when I looked up the word enough, the etymology of the word is the meaning of reaching or receiving together. And to me, that relates to my thinking around common sense and community sense. And in tonight's session, I'm going to relate that to the two kind of less thought about senses, taste as well as smell. And I was making a play on the word enough with the word funk as well, and thinking about funk in relationship to community sense as well. And we'll talk about that more as I go through the presentation. So in thinking about what it means for us to be humans and sapient creatures, I wanted to share this artwork from Shaniqua Gay called We Were Always Scientists. And I saw this piece in Chanda Prescott-Weinstein's book that I recently started reading. And I thought it was a strong piece to reflect on what does it mean for humans to be scientists? Because in our modern society, scientist has become a kind of professional label for only a certain group of people. And I kind of want to expand that title beyond just a kind of professional upper class notion of scientists to the idea that we all can be scientists in our own ways. So this picture stood out to me because it reflects on a kind of domestic approach to thinking about science, that the kitchen or the cooking space is also a laboratory, and who gets to define what a laboratory is usually about privilege and power. So I pulled this quote from Prescott-Weinstein's The Disordered Cosmos, and she wrote, "The trouble with physicists, there's the universe, and then there's the process of developing mathematical understanding of it. This is physics, and physics is a human process. Physics is not the universe. Rather, it is one very human attempt to get at its innards." And I love this quote because it stresses the difference between the existence of the world around us and how we as humans try to interpret that world around us through science, and how often we become so normalized to our own constructions and conceptions of things that we think that is the only possible way to interpret and understand the world around us, when there's many ways. So as I've mentioned in the previous sessions, I've been influenced by Louis Armstrong's work. And in his memoir, he mentioned that what he learned from his own mother was good sense and mother wit. And I kind of wanted to play on that by separating the M from mother and make it into a play on words, saying my other wit. That learning knowledges from various different other groups of living beings and inorganic beings helps us have a greater sense of understanding about the world around us. And in thinking about sense and wit outside of this kind of biocentric notion, which we'll talk about a little bit more with Sylvia Winter, to a kind of thinking more about the constructions of life. And that goes more into chemistry and physics, the building blocks of how we create the world around us. So in thinking about that, I wanted to share a video from Daniel J. Watts called Fish Heads, which he performed at the Louis Armstrong Museum. I'm gonna stop this screen share to share that video.
Yes, sir. In those days, you could take a newspaper and I'd go to the market, a fish market, and buy a whole newspaper full of fish heads. Just plain chopped off fish heads that they would usually put aside.
Yeah,
Well,
that'd be garbage for them, wouldn't it?
well, they just ain't got time to do what we did.
Yeah.
My mother would get the fish heads and take them home and cook them and clean them and cook them and put a lot of tomatoes, canned tomatoes in them, and call it curation, the Creole dish, and serve it on top of some rice. Boy, you talking about beautiful food and delicious. And the next morning, I go to school with a cabbage sandwich.
Cabbage sandwich?
Cabbage sandwich, and good leftover from last night.
Yeah.
Because the next morning, I got a fresh something to start, maybe a pork chop or something, or whatever.
For breakfast, the pork chop?
Anything we can eat for breakfast is all right with us. Glad to get it.
One man's trash is another man's treasure. So rummaging through trash heaps might produce a mass feast. Food made from fish heads, the nicest of dishes. What's fine wine and caviar, but bad grapes and fish eggs? So, and I imagine jazz was invented in a Black woman's kitchen. As improvisation, that is the making of any given situation, it's an heirloom handed down by way of survival. You want to keep breathing, you better improvise. You want to keep eating, you better learn to cook. So to make do, you make a stew. Add some rice to make it chew. Add a spice to make it new. Do that for life, that makes it blues. Yeah, I imagine jazz originated in a Black woman's kitchen, under a Black woman's care, under a Black woman's stare. It don't need no words. Something about the sounds of a rolling pin, rolling thin, some dough to go fold over a tin that's overflowing with that something special it holds within, and then stuffed in oven, baked gold, and then devoured. That started out as a wooden spoon in a bowl full of flour. Add an egg, cause you got one. Cup of milk, cause you got some. Boy, why don't you run across the way and see if Miss Dupree will let me borrow some honey, honey. Yeah, because see, it's the sweet spot that makes the beat hot. Sometime round ragtime, but way before bebop, way before cream and sugar were added. I imagine jazz was somewhere percolating in a black woman's kitchen, blowing the lids off of coffee pots, knowing that it was something black and strong and could get you going if it could just get into your system, maybe survive a lynching, maybe revive a victim. It couldn't possibly divide the living. So listen, let's get back to the kitchen where I am almost certain jazz was beating up on the upper lip of a black woman over the stove, no longer slaving, just making sure her babies had some beautiful food to eat, whipping up potatoes like magic or whipping up magic like potatoes. Either way, she's whipping, driven with intuition, dipping that wooden spoon in for taste test sipping. Cayenne, oregano, paprika, salt. Now let that simmer. Savory improvisation, creating on the fly, and the fly on the wall might fly into that dish. It smells so good, you better fly it on out of here. And where is that boy with that borrowed honey? Because money is scarce, but that's no excuse not to take your time. Good food takes time. Jazz takes time and swings it. Stretches it out like a life dodging death in a game of tag, because hunger is always around the corner, but starvation is often kept at bay when a black woman has a kitchen and some time on her hands to riff on whatever she's got. Don't always got much, but there's no need for her to lose her head just because a few fish have lost theirs. So she improvises. Jazzes her way through a meal until it's fit for a king. Where is that boy with that borrowed honey? I just hope he hurries home before this coubillon gets cold.
So in thinking about this poem from Daniel J. Watts, in which he wrote about Louis Armstrong's mother, Mary, who was a cook and was able to take the scraps that were put in the trash or just finding scraps around and turn that into a meal, and how that reflects on the musical genre of jazz. And so I wanted to relate that to thinking about how we can view our own bodies and senses as kind of improvisational riffing or processors as well, that we are receivers and interpreters of environmental elements around us or signals around us. And we're able to take those elements and signals and turn them into various things. And that includes incorporating errors and failures or being flexible in a way. And one of my favorite poems from Nikki Giovanni called Ego Tripping, in which she says, "I am so hip, even my errors are correct." So the ability to change and transform things is a tool that we have as human beings. And I also wanted to mention this quote from Anthony Elms, who talks about improvisation as one of America's best inventions, just like jazz, and that improv allows you to deeply listen, exchange energy, and respond, and solve problems with multiple applications and roots. So in thinking of improvisation, I also thought of alchemy, which is the precursor term to the word chemistry, and how alchemy and chemistry are about transmutation processes. And the root of alchemy was the idea of this kind of mixing bowl of juice or sap, or it could also be about some sort of mass or material or earth, and how that relates to Mary cooking up a dish in her kitchen as well. So in thinking about chemistry and physics and alchemy and moving away from this kind of biocentric thinking of this thing that is already established, it made me come to think about what is actually natural. And for me, natural is a call and response, an ever evolving practice or process. A call is a loud sound projecting into space like a baby crying. A response is a libation ritual, is a drink offering, is a reflected sound, is a solution, is the baby getting its nourishment from its my other. So in continuing to think about natural, I wanted to use a couple of quotes from James Baldwin that helped me to think about natural. So this is from his collected essays. He says, "We spend vast amounts of our time and emotional energy in learning how not to be natural and in eluding the trap of our own nature. And it therefore becomes very difficult to know exactly what is meant when we speak of the unnatural. It is not possible to have it both ways, to use nature at one time as the final arbiter of human conduct, and at another to oppose her as angrily as we do." And this one from The Male Prison, he writes, "It does not seem to me that nature helps us very much when we need illumination in human affairs. I am certainly convinced that it is one of the greatest impulses of mankind to arrive at something higher than a natural state. How to be natural does not seem to be a problem. Quite the contrary. The great problem is how to be, in the best sense of the kaleidoscopic word, a man." And in thinking about those quotes from Baldwin, and as well as my question of what is natural and natural as a kind of call and response, I wanted to rethink natural in general beyond our current conception of natural. And I bring up the idea of our current thinking of science in general, where I call it the sweetness of the language of science and how that relates to capitalism, colonialism, these kind of fixed states of being, these extractive processes, and as Catherine McKittrick talks about in her work, plantation logic, versus labor conditions of knowledge making, AKA those who create the ever-evolving super friction of reality or natural. And that learning the labor conditions or the processes of how things are made helps one to alchemize freedom, helps us to value essential and service work, and also find true nourishment and medicine for ourselves. So in thinking about sense as a kind of quickening process where it's much like the form of cooking where you're putting different materials together to create a sense. And in thinking also about the etymology of sense being related to scent, that you're being sent something as well as you're sending something back out, and that kind of co-collaboration of sense making. And this quote's from Lorna Goodson, Nanny, which is reference to Nanny of the Maroons. And it was, "I was sent to tell that to history." So the history being a co-collaboration. So this is from Fred Moten's Taste, Dissonance, Flavor, Escape. "What does being sent into the terrible pathways and precincts of the human do to or for the human? Eruptions of that thematics of flight towards which Hortense Spillers moves, which forms the inspiriting locomotive foundation of the theory and history of Blackness. What Cedric Robinson might call an eternally alien immanence, or more precisely from a radical materiality whose animation, fantasy of another form of life, has been overlooked by masterful looking." So this quote to me represents how Blackness and Black ways of knowing are about knowing the other and about the knowledge of the other, and how being human essentially is about this constant transformation, these themes of flight, this alienness that we're constantly navigating throughout a space, and how we can look at the idea of natural as that kind of constant re-engagement and renegotiating of different intelligences and knowledges. So I think of also Fred Moten's quote of what it means to consent to not being a single being. I think it's important that he used the word consent, because if you look up the etymology of consent, consent means to sense together, and it implies the idea of a community sense. So what does it mean to consent to not being a single being? It's acknowledging the other kinds of intelligences and knowledges that exist. And I think of this quote from Sylvia Wynter in her No Humans Involved essay, in which she writes, "The starving fella or the jobless inner city, NHI, no humans involved, the global new poor or les dames. Fanon pointed out, does not have to inquire into the truth. They are the truth. It is we who institute this truth." And this reminds me of Prescott Weinstein's quote about physics, that there's a difference between how we describe the world around us and how we think about the world around us, and what the world is simply, and that the world itself has its own sense of its own truth. So I'm thinking of Sylvia Wynter's theory of biomythos creatures. What is sense? What is being human? And this is all from On Being Human as Praxis. So for Sylvia Wynter's work, she emphasizes the importance of decolonizing or weaning, in a sense, from a purity concept of knowledge. This idea of what we know is the absolute of knowledge, to a more porous body of knowledge. And this is a quote from On Being Human as Praxis: "The difficult task of situating our intellectual questions outside our present system of knowledge in order to historicize and share our futures differently." And Sylvia Wynter also talked about in her essay, is development a purely empirical concept or also teleological, a perspective from we the underdeveloped, to that we need to distance ourselves from this kind of Western idea of rationality, which usually is a kind of narrow concept that reinforces oppressive systems. Or as she says, what you don't see does not exist to you. And Sylvia Wynter wrote in The Pope Must Have Been Drunk, the King of the Castle is a Madman. Human beings are magical, bios and logos, words made flesh, muscle, and bone, animated by hope and desire, belief materialized in deeds, deeds which crystallize our actualities. And the maps of springs always have to be redrawn again in undared forms. So this quote emphasizes how we need to move beyond just thinking of ourselves as just biocentric creatures, which goes into these essentialist ideas of how we think we rose into being, and instead also think of ourselves as mythic creatures as well, where how we think about language, how we perceive the world around us also, and how we construct the world around us through our language also helps shape the world around us, not just our biological aspect of us. And this goes into Sylvia Wynter's use of Fanon's concept of sociogeny, which is socially constructed phenomenon or mask, and how that differs from phylogeny, which is genetic inheritances, and ontogeny, which is the organism's biological development. And that was from his Black Skins and White Masks. So all of this that Sylvia Wynter presents in her work is about interrogating the figure of man as the measuring stick against which all life is measured, which produces racial violence as common sense. Because whose sense are we talking about? And whose stories are we talking about? And in thinking about how this relates to virtual worlds, where the word virtual comes from virtues, how our deeds, our desires, what we want of our life also helps to shape the world in which we live. and that we need new myths, new communications, new poetics, new codes to define what is meant to be human, or as Winter mentions, the science of the word from Amy Césaire. So back to the idea of call and response. How do we respond to our own presence on Earth? So in thinking about the underutilized, in a sense, senses of taste and smell, I wanted to think about taste and smell in relationship to other ways of knowing. Volatile chemicals are associated with taste and smell. And the word volatile means things that are flying and constantly in motion and moving around. So I tend to think of taste and smell as a more communal oriented senses. They have to do with us not just receiving stimulation, but also projecting back out through our nose, through our mouth. Our mouth is associated with storytelling and voice and speech. Things also come out of our nose as well, and our nose comes out of our face. So this kind of projecting symbolisms associated with our mouths and our noses. And I associate those senses with flight, emotion, motion, and knowing otherwise. For another example, pheromones, when we think of pheromones, the root of that word has to do with hormones, which means things that make our bodies move. So in thinking of taste and smell, I want to look at a few works that inspired my thinking in relation to those senses. And one of them is Camille Yarborough's The Iron Pot Cooker. And in thinking about that work, the reason why I found out about Camille Yarborough's work was I was listening to Fatboy Slim's Praise You song, and I was curious about the origin of the song, that part that you hear, we've come a long, long way together through the hard times and the good. I wanna celebrate you, baby. I wanna praise you like I should. And when I found out Camille Yarborough's album and actually listened to the entire album, that song is the only song on the album that has a sense of sweetness to it. Most of the album actually has to do with the hard realities of being Black in America. And at that time, it was during the 70s in which she produced that album. So I thought it was interesting that Fatboy Slim, out of all of the tracks on that album, decided to take the sweetest sounding song for his own use. So in thinking of that, it made me think about the seduction of sweet and thinking about addictions as well and what we normalize ourselves to. And when you look up the etymology of the word addiction, it actually means towards sight or towards language, diction either meaning to show or to speak. And I thought it was interesting the ways that we can program and condition ourselves to what is normal. And that Camille Yarborough's The Iron Pot Cooker is about deconditioning ourselves from what is considered normal, which is usually white, cis, hetero, upper class, colonialist thinking. So in thinking about that, it also related to me the idea of the drug, right? The drug as being our issue with containers or these normalized story ideas or storages, as I wrote there. And how do we think about recreating stories in the same way that Camille Yarborough does in her record, as a kind of computer processing, digesting and embodying knowledges of the other. and that the iron pot that she mentions here works as a kind of external exchange where you're taking various knowledges and creating a kind of new story out of those various knowledges for oneself. And I'll share the links later on for you to listen on your own. But I wanted to mention one of the quotes that is in this track called Dream Panic, Sunny the Ripoff Man, Lily Sally, the super sex star, taking care of business. Genuine, programmed, computerized, colonized, dehumanized, guaranteed to self-destruct ripoff man, come to see him while you can. And so even in the 70s, Camille Yarbrough was talking about that, the idea of the computer as a kind of reference to kind of robotics and colonization and the relationship between the two. And then also in thinking of the iron pot, I was also thinking of Anansi, Aunt Nancy, throughout the African diaspora, and Anansi's pot of wisdom, and how Anansi has this pot that they drop by accident, and through dropping the wisdom by accident, the wisdom spreads through different rivers and sources, and how we can think of that spreading of wisdom kind of like these different external exchange wares. So in thinking of these kind of different external exchange wares, I was thinking about the idea of the matrix and the blue pill versus the red pill. And I wanted to think about the pill differently. And I was thinking of Parliament Funkadelic's songs, Dr. Funkenstein and Cerno's Devoid of Funk, and the idea of the big pill, that it's not about these two binaries of red versus blue, but a kind of all over encompassing knowledge. And how we can think of that in relation to how we think of improv and call and response, that it gives you a wider resource pool to pull from, to think of different ways to transform one's conditions and situations. And this is a quote from the same song I mentioned earlier. Ancient stubborn plants determined to bloom. It is there they work their magic moja, their okra. It is there the magic deed is done. The magic word is said to nourish the precious living, to nourish the precious living dead. And here, Camille uses cooking as a way of transforming the displacement of Black people across the diaspora. So my question is, how do we engage the unknown or the unforeseen knowledges? Another story I was thinking of was James Baldwin's Sonny's Blues, in reference to the idea of the addiction of scientific language, and how the way we think of science and scientific language reflects the limitations of certainty. And that certainty is usually white, cis, hetero, patriarchal, upper class, colonialist, empirical knowledge. And how that distorts communal knowledges or communal senses, and also creates a lack of trust in knowledges and senses of others. And I quote this from Chanda Prescott-Weinstein. Experiments are an empirical activity. The problem is that not all empirical data is accessible, because social asymmetries, differences, mean that we don't all have access to the same sensory experiences. There are other ways of knowing that aren't purely empirical. And I use this quote from Barbados sayings. My mom's from Barbados, and also Prescott-Weinstein has Barbadian heritage as well. And I thought it would be interesting to include this quote: hard ears you won't hear, own way you gon' feel. And that being a reference to, if you don't listen to others' knowledges, you're going to feel the effects of not listening later. And so and thinking about not listening to other kinds of knowledges and ways of beings, it made me think of the story in Sonny's Blues, where the narrator is engaging his brother Sonny, who has a drug addiction. And instead of being able to just empathize with his own brother and deal with his own feelings about it, he kind of is finding security within him being a teacher of algebra and kind of trying to make sense of the world around him through this kind of scientific mathematic language. And I thought it was interesting when I looked up the word algebra that it comes from the Arabic algebra and the idea of putting bones back together, reunion of broken parts, restoration, and repair or reparations. So what does it mean to put things back together and make sense of things outside of the ways that we've been taught of how we make sense of things? And sometimes making sense of things involves a kind of risk of experimentation and seeking out underground new knowledges, aka swimming in deep water, which is mentioned in Sonny's Blues. So the narrator speaks of two darknesses in the short story. And he mentions the darkness of the world in which he lives, in which Black people are struggling to survive within the ghetto. And he also mentions the darkness that produces the spectacle of the screen when you go into the movie theater. And I used those two darknesses that the narrator speaks of to also talk about how he relates to his own brother. That he sees the darkness of the world around him, the darkness of his own feelings and the complications of his relationships to that world, but also treating Sonny as this kind of spectacle of addiction, as well as a spectacle of addiction to the narrator's own sense of wanting rationality and control, and this kind of white upper class normality, which I call a scream. And in one of the scenes in the book, Sonny says that he wants to be a jazz musician, and that causes the narrator to panic because he doesn't think being a jazz musician is a kind of career that is up to code in a sense. And you see throughout his engagements with his brother how much his brother and him are struggling to understand each other because essentially they're speaking two different languages. And I wanted to mention some quotes from Sonny, who has a different understanding of what it means to be human outside of this kind of normalized scientific language that the narrator is moving more towards. And in thinking about suffering, Sonny says, but nobody just takes it. Everybody tries not to. You're just hung up on the way some people try. It's not your way. And I thought that quote really stood out because of thinking about addiction, that addiction is not just the spectacle of people with specific addictions to specific drugs, that you can make anything into a drug because it is a human thing of us trying to make sense of the world, that even scientific language and mathematical language can be used as a drug as well. And in thinking about the sense of smell and funk as well, this quote from Sonny, I was all by myself at the bottom of something, stinking and sweating and crying and shaking, and I smelled it, my stink. And I thought I'd die if I couldn't get away from it. And yet all the same, I knew that everything I was doing was just locking me in with it. And I didn't know. He paused, still flattening the beer can. I didn't know, I still didn't know. Something kept telling me that maybe it was good to smell your own stink, but I didn't think that was what I'd been trying to do, and who can stand it? And I think this part of the story highlights how Sonny has his own sense of himself and an own truth and knowledge that he carries within him. And he's been struggling throughout the story to express that to his brother, who has a hard time understanding him. And it was conversation that his brother, the narrator, begins to understand who Sonny is as a person. And that reflects how one's view of ourselves and how others view us can affect how we relate to one another and relate to the world around us. Language is packed with mixtures of history. And in the story, Baldwin talks about the description of music, that how we hear music is different than how someone produces music. That music is like that cooking process where many different things are developing within someone's body, and that becomes the music that comes out of them. And what we hear out of that and how we interpret that is different than how someone senses themselves. And so language and how we communicate with each other and how we understand each other's senses of beings are always shifting and changing. So in thinking further about the drug of addiction, I also wanted to talk about the drug of the commodified consumption of Blackness. And one of my favorite songs is Nina Simone's For Women. And I think it's interesting that the names of each of the women all are related to food. Sarah is a name that can mean princess in Hebrew, but it also was a storehouse or a place of exchange, like a marketplace. Saffronia has to do with saffron spice. Sweet thing obviously is sugar, and peaches is fruit. So in thinking about the relationships of the names to the characters, it made me think of the song being about the consumption of Black women's labor in general, whether that's physical labor, emotional labor, sexual labor, or resistance labor as well. So in thinking about sweetness again, I wanted to bring up Kara Walker's The Subtlety, also called The Sugar Sphinx. And I'll be reading some quotes from Natalie Hopkinson's Long Reads essay about it. So Natalie describes the sculpture is 40 tons of sugar molded into a ghostly white apparition, part mammy, part sphinx. And this was on the plaque at the Domino Sugar Factory where the exhibition was located. A subtlety, or the marvelous sugar baby, an homage to the unpaid and overworked artisans who have refined our sweet taste from the cane fields to the kitchens of the New World on the occasion of the demolition of the Domino sugar refining plant. And Hopkinson writes, "We have come to expect bizarre reactions from sugar. It is sensory and symbolic overload. Refined sugar was first marketed as a drug, processed and presented as a gift. It expresses love and promises carnal pleasure. The history and ongoing agony caused by sugar are mostly hidden from public view. Its sexual brutality is shrouded by amnesia and silence. Much like the 21st century costs paid for smartphones, cheap clothes, and disposable trinkets, it's out of sight, out of mind. For those of us with roots in the Caribbean, our destinies were shaped by the demands of sugar and plantation life, and the historic moment in the 18th and 19th centuries when they became engines for Western empires. Our domestic lives are still being shaped by the culture of domination that took root in those fields." The slave trade, sugar's sickening byproduct, would eventually claim its place alongside the Gulag, the killing fields, and the concentration camps as one of the greatest atrocities in human history. Andrea Stewart explains in Sugar in the Blood. The triangular trade system between the sugar estates and the global South acted as a buffer between European and American consumers and the brutalities that produced them. But as Stewart writes, sugar profits helped the English forget and ultimately led to become the greatest slaving nation in the world. Slavery drove down prices and expanded access beyond the elite with the leisure and wealth to amuse themselves with subtleties. And subtleties were these sugar toys that were edible, and they were expensive and only the elite could afford them. It is this nasty aftertaste that flooded our senses at Kara Walker's Domino Sugar Refinery installation in 2014. The sugar sphinx is a forceful symbol of an exploitative global past that has not passed. In fact, it was being recreated right in front of us as people took selfies that mocked the sugar sphinx, sexualized her, and humiliated her. They tried to take her down from her sweet throne. The sugar sphinx is a monument to Black women, that mighty mode of production that generated the most valuable commodity of all, unpaid workers who were the collateral that made empire possible. So in thinking of sugar as also a kind of drug, but a drug that is legalized in ways that other drugs are not, it made me think of these 5 ideas. Of 1, consumption of sugar being related to predatory empires and economies and Black POC and poor labor. And this is also connected to what I mentioned earlier about the addiction of the sweetness of scientific language versus the actual labor of knowledge making. And so the sugar sphinx becomes its own kind of riddle, right? This entanglement between the seductive, addictive monstrosity of sweetness, or the spectacle of sweet things, comforts, desires, power, what is normalized in our society, and the high cost to produce those sweet things, as well as the overconsumption, the nauseatingly sweet things we use to cover up the actual funk, and the funk being the exploitation of various classes of people. 2, about redefining our tastes, that consumption shapes and reshapes our brain structures and our desires to want more of these sweet things or these comforts or what's considered normal, instead of actually interrogating whether these things should be normal. 3, the stereotype of the mammy as well in relation to the sugar sphinx, how the mammy represents this kind of screen of sweetness, right? The image of the mammy as this happy person who is happy to just do the labor and do the work of taking care, in a sense, of the enslavers, and how that's a screen for hiding the actual exploitation of the labor of Black women. For reading Tavia Nyong'o's Afro-fabulations, they mentioned the idea of photosynthesis, and it made me think of what Natalie Hopkinson describes of our obsession with social media, where social media and capturing and consuming these various kind of crystallizing ideas and notions of things, and how that synthesizes our perceptions of time and these different understandings of history over its duration, much in the way that plants capture light and energy to make its own nourishment and sugars, and how we use these different kind of tools and processes to kind of create our own kind of realities and normalizing of reality. And then last 5, the connection between nausea, noise, nose, news, and nose, and how Kara Walker's piece is a kind of reflection on how we navigate through the compression of all these volatile motions and emotions that is on the what I call the computer ship, and how these various conflicts of senses can cause us to feel conjuncted in our body, that what we're seeing, these screens, are not related to how we're feeling, which is the heavy weight of history. So in thinking of smelling the funk, and back to Tavia Nyong'o's Afro-fabulations, I bring up the queer practice of the read, which is being able to comprehend and analyzing another, an environment, a system, and having to do with the ability to have interpretive skills. And Afro-fabulations is, as Nyong'o describes, the crafting or reconstructing of stories and histories or systems of values outside of the official mainstream. Read white, cis, hetero, patriarchal, Western capitalists, and reading outside of that documentation or representation. And it acts as a kind of interpolation or interpretation from other voices. And it speaks to how our material realities are not this constant, fixed, static thing, but something that's constantly being reordered and rearranged. And therefore it's responsive or changing, or a kind of changing same, as Amiri Baraka talks about. And I relate this to back chat in the Caribbean, shade, reading, and other hacks of the color line, as Nyong'o calls it. And the ability to have these various intersecting voices allows for, as Nyong'o calls it, incompossibilities, when worlds of fact, or what is considered things that exist, and things that don't exist, or is considered not real or fiction, or the not yet known or not yet recorded, intersect. And what is considered fiction usually has to do with who has the power and control to make something a reality or a fact. And in thinking about the musical idiom of funk, and as I mentioned earlier, the idea of funk, that funk is related to the idea of community sense. And Nyong'o talks about the idea of moving beyond natural associations of funk to seeing funk as a performance modality that disrupts heteronormative embodiment and straight timing. The word implies the immediacy of the body in its sweaty, stinking presence, when the taste and touch of bodies connecting with and corroborating other bodies on a dance floor get especially dense and saturated, when the rush of notes piling up on notes reaches a particular crescendo before crashing against a sonic beachhead, and the rhythm section then beats a musical trail out of a retreating foam. Funk is quintessentially social music. Funk isn't the solution to anti-Blackness, but it puts the problem into solution in the chemical sense of dissolving it into the liquid of sweat, letting new configurations crystallize only when things eventually, if regrettably, cool back down. And that also funk offers a kind of reorganization of the senses. So funk as a musical art form, as well as a performance art form, allows us to not focus on what is seen purely, right? Back to Sylvia Wynter's idea of what I don't see does not exist, right? But emphasizing our other senses like taste and smell that allow for different perceptions of how we view our own bodies and how we view bodies that are considered other, and how it creates a greater sense of community sense. And Nyong'o also describing funk in relation to chemistry, and thinking of chemistry as this kind of big cooking pot. So in smelling the funk, I also thought of other words that sounded similar to funk, like fungibility, function, and fruiting bodies of life. So fungibility has to do with the idea of a fruiting body, and function also is related to fungibility. And to me, they both all represent this idea of active, responsive bodies to environmental conditions. And in previous sessions, I mentioned both Invisible Man and Mumbo Jumbo. And so I wanted to bring some quotes that talk about smell in both of those books. Invisible Man's Old Bad Air, with Louis Armstrong, one half of me says, open the window and let the foul air out, while the other says it was good green corn before the harvest. Of course, Louis was kidding. He wouldn't have thrown old bad air out because it would have broken up the music and the dance, when it was the good music that came from the bell of old bad air's horn that counted. Old bad air is still around with his music and his dancing and his diversity, and I'll be up around with mine. So Ralph Ellison mentioning how the funk is part of that process of creation of music. Mumbo Jumbo, other plagues were accompanied by bad air, malaria. Jess Gru's victims said that the air was as clean as they had ever seen it, and that there was the aroma of roses and perfumes, which had never before enticed the nostrils. And I thought that was interesting in contrast to the Invisible Man quote of how sweet smelling isn't always it may not be always a good thing as well, that sweet smelling might be the result of some sort of sickness, or that the perception of something smelling strong or bad is perception, the same way that like the perception of something smelling sweet is also a perception that we're conditioned to, and that we can have different perceptions of something that smells strong or bad and something that smells sweet. And I wanted to reference Karl Pope's work, The Bad Air Smelled of Roses, his essay that is a poster essay installation. And in thinking about the recipes of knowledges, that his work is about pulling from various different knowledges and, as he says, mapping an immense field of ideas. And that our approach to truth or knowledge is about that kind of mapping of an immense idea fields. And for Pope, Blackness is not limited to African-American identity, but encompasses all that is unseen, unknown, oppressed, forgotten, or rejected. The posters therefore present varied and often conflicting voices that the artist hopes will challenge viewers to look beyond mainstream preconceptions and experience Blackness as a natural, expansive realm of alternative possibilities. And that relates to what I was thinking about in terms of how do we perceive various smells. So in thinking about how we perceive various smells, it reminded me once again of Parliament Funkadelic's character of Sir Nose Devoid of Funk, and how he's portrayed as this villainous character with this mask on his face of a long nose that may remind you of Pinocchio. So in a sense, his character is kind of this kind of drug dealer character in the Parliament Funkadelic lore. And I thought it was interesting looking at his long nose to think about other mythic characters who could be related to this kind of long-nosed character. So I thought of the plague doctors from the bubonic plague in the Middle Ages, and how they would wear these beak-like masks that were filled with sweet smelling roses and flowers to kind of cover up the scent of the dead, because they thought that the smell of the dead was the reason for the plague spreading, when actually the plague spreading had to do with the ground being toxic, that there were a lot of animals roaming around that had that were carrying that plague and spreading it to humans. It had nothing to do with the air, but they believed that it was being spread through the air being bad. And I thought that was interesting to find out about the plague doctors, but also thinking about the hounds and hounds chasing fugitive slaves through scent, and also thinking about the Egyptian god Tehuti, who is known as the god of wisdom and writing, and how we can think about these characters with these long beaks differently. And Tehuti is also related to characters like Anubis, who is the Egyptian god of funerary practices, and Seth, who is the god of chaos. And then thinking of how that can relate to concepts of knowledge making and processes of knowledge making through understanding death, through understanding chaos as well. So in thinking of a character like Tehuti, I wanted to bring up Catherine McKittrick's idea of plantation logic or plantocratic logic. Plantocratic logic versus alchemizing freedom, which is my concept. And I wanted to bring up this fact of the ibis with its long beak has a special ability to find food underground by detecting vibrations with their beak. So they have this sense of remote touch or a probing sense that is also symbiotic, because the ibis would eat the parasitic snails in the Nile River, which allowed the Egyptians to swim in the water safely. So in thinking about that fact, I thought about it in relationship to underground sense that is also community sense oriented. So in thinking about plantocratic logic versus alchemizing freedom, I thought of how our current culture of this kind of capitalistic, colonialistic surveillance culture, which is often extractive, versus a curiosity centered culture that is not about being extractive, but about being part of community and cultivating a space. And Catherine McKittrick describes plantocratic logic as a colonial plantation geographic logic about accumulation, dispossession, exclusion, and dehumanization, centering human as the supreme standard of being. And it ties Black intellectual life to corporal and effective labor. So labor that is being extracted. And I bring up this quote from George Washington Carver that I think is interesting in thinking about how do we cultivate ground and how do we cultivate space that is healthy for a diverse set of beings. And he says, the farmer whose soil produces less every year is unkind to it in some way. That is, he is not doing it what he should. He is robbing it of some substance it must have, and he becomes therefore a soil robber rather than a progressive farmer. And this quote makes me think of the difference between plantocratic logic versus alchemizing freedom, where plantocratic logic is about how much I can take from the ground instead of how much I can cultivate a space where the ground is healthy and therefore I'm healthy as well in relation to the ground. So in thinking of that, I wanted to reference some quotes from Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye in reference to the character Pecola and how not cultivating the ground leads to a lot of the sicknesses and community disruption that we have now. And this quote reads, "It never occurred to either of us that the earth itself might have been unyielding. We have dropped our seeds in our own little plot of black dirt, just as Pacola's father had dropped his seeds in his own plot of black dirt. Our innocence and faith were no more productive than his lust or despair." The soil is bad for certain kinds of flowers. Certain seeds it will not nurture, certain fruit it will not bear. And when the land kills of its own volition, we acquiesce and say the victim had no right to live. We are wrong, of course, but it doesn't matter. It's too late. At least on the edge of my town, among the garbage and the sunflowers of my town, it is much, much, much too late. And these two quotes were important for me in thinking about how we cultivate the ground in relationship to what other living beings need. And in that relationship, that also helps us. But so much of the way we think about consumption, the way we think of science and various processes of understanding is very much centered on the human and what we can get out of it and what we can extract out of it, and not this kind of symbiotic relationship of understanding the ground and understanding what different plants need. And that also works for how we think about a community as well. And I bring up this quote that was written about Pacola, and it reads, "She spent her days, her tendril sap green days, walking up and down, her head jerking to the beat of a drummer so distant only she could hear. Elbows bent, hands on shoulders, she flailed her arms like a bird in an eternal, grotesquely futile effort to fly. Beating the air, a winged but ground bird, intent on the blue void it could not reach, could not even see, but which filled the valleys of her mind." And so you see in Pacola's actions from the book that she's trying to escape. And what is she trying to escape? Not just the abuse of her father, but also the neglect of a community that wasn't really willing to tend to her and the trauma that she was dealing with. And in thinking about this volatility of her actions in relationship to smell, in relationship to taste, and the idea of when someone is not being provided the nourishment they need, it creates this kind of volatility. So in thinking about someone who realized that they were not receiving the nourishment that they needed, I thought about Harriet Tubman and her quote, "If you want a taste of freedom, keep going." And Harriet Tubman is not described as a scientist, but in my view, she is a scientist in her relationship to nature and how she engaged nature in order to help her understand herself and the world around her and be able to find liberation for herself and others. So I think of Harriet Tubman as both a naturalist as well as an alchemist of freedom. And that brings up my question of who gets to be a scientist, thinking of science outside of a professionalized, established Western context, as Prescott Weinstein talks about. And this is on the right, the Harriet Tubman Memorial that's in Harlem, called Swing Low by Allison Sarr. And I mentioned Allison Sarr in a previous session that had to do with Topsy, the character of Topsy. And I think this piece is relevant in thinking about how Harriet engaged nature. She's wearing this green dress, and this dress has the faces of other people that she rescued throughout her journey of liberation. And you see her coming out of these roots she's running away. And Sarr described those roots as the roots of slavery. And so when I look at that image, I see her alchemizing these roots of slavery to transform them into her own liberation. And those roots also included the inheritances that she got from her family as well. And not only was Harriet Tubman a fugitive, a spy, a cook, a nurse, and an herbalist, but I also think she was an astronomer as well in how she used the stars to navigate herself to freedom. And some other interesting facts was her mother, Harriet Green, from whose name that she took on from her real name, which is Araminta Ross. She took her mother's name to hide out as she would flee. And her father, Benjamin Ross. Her mother was a cook and her father was a woodsman. So from both of her parents, she learned how to see the transformation of nature, whether it was cooking or through understanding trees and different plants in the woods. And in her life, Harriet was able to create an eating house. She developed herbal remedies as a nurse for the Union Army. And you see throughout her life how she had a strong understanding of a relationship to food, such as being able to forage in the forest. She was able to get sassafras, black cherry, and pawpaw, and she knew what was safe to eat and not safe to eat. And that was helpful for her being a conductor and finding nourishment for various different people who were running away from slavery. And so her understanding of her engagement and relationship to nature is about her understanding and analyzing the ground, as well as the systematic conditions that produce social illness. That it's not just about nature, but also understanding the human condition, that slavery produces enslavers and enslaved people, and both conditions are toxic roles for humanity, for society in general. And her ability to know how to cultivate food and cultivate space and ground for hers and others' liberation was the path and step towards healing. So in thinking of her relationship to the stars, I thought about the Big Dipper and the North Star, and following the mother, the my other gourd, and the my other ground. And seeing how relationships to constellations and understanding constellations is also connected to our relationship to the ground. That it's about orienting the full self through our environmental connections. And in thinking of groundskeeping, I'm thinking of Beronda L. Montgomery's Lessons for Plants, and thinking about groundskeeping, not gatekeeping. That groundskeeping is about cultivating a ground for a diversity of beings to exist. Biodiversity versus monocultures, which George Washington Carver talked about, this kind of extractive relationship to the ground. And in thinking about the ground and the underground, I wanted to bring up this quote from Chanda Prescott Weinstein. When she was watching the Underground TV show. The Underground TV show portrayed enslaved people as thinkers, schemers, planners, and dreamers. In one scene, a character is tasked with building a bridge. It was in that moment that I realized that he was an engineer who didn't know how to read. From that point forward, I understood plantation and other sites of slavery as places of work with not just a skilled workforce, but a workforce with advanced skills. And so understanding how we think about the ground and our relationship to the ground can also influence how we think about our relationship to other people, to not think of them as extractive in an extractive way, but instead thinking of them in relation, how we can see people differently. So in thinking about that, I wanted to end with a poem that I have in process called La Diablesse's Origins. My Body is a Contradiction. And La Diablesse is a mythic character in Caribbean folklore, and she is presented as a beautiful woman who also has animal feet. It's either a goat hooves or cow hooves. And hearing that about the character reminded me of the being of the Sphinx, how the Sphinx is this figure who is, in a sense, a community kind of sensory kind of figure, how they have different knowledges from different living beings within their own body. And I start with this quote from Chanda Prescott Weinstein of Particles Don't Obey Binaries. I am a not developing. I am only a slave to my own maskering. The improvisatory now, a mixing gourd bubbling up into dub. Of my presence, I plunge into the deep piling up to be a meta symbolism. My mouth is a bender of trees like the wind blowing, like a feather on the edge of a deep chasm. I know what I knows. I am a carrier of the motion of life. I exchange those motions for other motions. I and you are a riddle, a big all-consuming mouth called myth. We all suffer from an industrial complex and corrected for easy consumption. Alienated from our bodies, has made body an antagonist in the myth's reconstruction. My body is a contradiction, a beauty of my own logic rising rhythmically constant out of the depths of my wild fugitivity. As a captured being, what message have I received? And a go, beyond binary code of hacker and hasher to an ame named Alkymist. And Alkymist is the mythic character that I created for this project. So to end, I want to leave you with this prompt of recipes of knowledge, ruminations, AKA digestive process of codes. So ruminations is related to the word rumen, which has to do with the digestive process of cows. And I thought it's interesting that our thought processes can also be related to a kind of digestive process. So the question I'm asking you is, what knowledges are you craving? What are you scenting or sensing? What is sending for you, and what are you sending? And I want to leave you with this quote from Audre Lorde's The Uses of the Erotic. During World War II, we bought sealed plastic packets of white, uncolored margarine with a tiny, intense pellet of yellow coloring perched like a topaz just inside the clear skin of the bag. We would leave the margarine out for a while to soften, and then we would pinch the little pellet to break it inside the bag, releasing the rich yellowness into the soft, pale mass of margarine. Then taking it carefully between our fingers, we would knead it gently back and forth and over until the color had spread throughout the whole pound bag of margarine, thoroughly coloring it. I find the erotic such a kernel within myself. When released from its intense and constrained pellet, it flows through and colors my life with a kind of energy that heightens and sensitizes and strengthens all my experience. We have been raised to fear the yes within ourselves, our deepest cravings. So this quote made me think of back to Parliament Funkadelic's idea of the big pill, and the idea of this pill or pellet or medicine that helps us to color our lives in new ways. And I invite you to respond in thinking about what kind of pills of knowledges that you need to help color your life in a different kind of way. And thank you. So I'm going to stop here. So time's almost up, but I don't know if we can stay for like an extra 10 minutes for Oxy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think folks, feel free to, share any thoughts you have in the chat, or take this time to write based on the prompts that Sherese you shared at the end. But yeah, Sherese, feel free to, facilitate however you feel is right. And if yeah.
Yeah, if anyone needs to leave, feel free. This is being recorded, so you can watch it later. I'll give you a few minutes to write if you'd like to, and then I'll share some of what was said in the comments and chat, and then we can end with that. Feel free to keep writing, and as I've done with the other sessions, I will send a PDF afterwards for everyone to review all the information as well. Just want to share some of what is in the chat. Babette referenced the excerpts from James Baldwin. They were utterly inspired. Yes, definitely read James Baldwin's work. The way his mind works, I love it. Aretha Brown mentioned that sugar was the first drug trade. Reading Natalie Hopkins' work made me think about sugar differently as well, and how what is considered a drug is also determined by power and privilege, and what is profitable to who. And Babette also mentioned sugar as a drug, addictive and causing sickness. Molasses was fed to slaves as well as rum, and how alcohol is often used as a way to kind of pacify the masses as well. Babette also mentioned the use of Christianity as a carrot and stick, a way of currying favor with the master and teaching enslaved people to read with a punishable offense. Yes, and how also, like in talking about scientific language being a drug, religion can also be a drug as well, used to kind of pacify people from kind of going after their own freedom and liberation. And Babette also mentioned many of the great English-speaking poets were addicted to opium. So we definitely need to have a kind of reconstructed perception of how we think about drugs in our society and how that relates to power. And Babette said, I was not able to understand the writing of Toni Morrison until I attended her memorial service and listened to Oprah Winfrey recite her work. It made the character come alive. I went home and read Song of Solomon with greater depth. Thank you for sharing. DePrater, you have woven a hefty web. Is there a basic understanding, premise, final thought you want me to leave with from the beautiful thinkings about your travel tonight? Gratitude. Basically, how we think about sense differently. A lot of how we think about knowledge and sense tends to be related to, as Sylvia Wynter mentioned, what I don't see doesn't exist. So it's heavily fixed on our sight and not the rest of our body. And a lot of what I'm thinking about in terms of knowledge making and knowledge and concepts of knowledge is about how do we connect the rest of our body to thinking about knowledge, not just what we observe through our eyes, but observe through our nose, our mouth, our touch, which we'll talk about in the next session, to think about knowledge and think about sense in a wider, a more broad way. And Roxy mentioned, I think there may not be only one thought. Our understanding of things, of the world, of ourselves, of history are complex, affected by senses beyond a select narrative and rationality. And I'm sharing also makes me think of a reciprocity that is missing in society, thinking around nature beyond exploitation and extraction. What other relationship can one have with nature? Thank you, Roxy. Thank you, Lottie. Thank you, Malika. Babette, no problem if it's too long. Feel free if you want to share it later through email, as well as the performance in December, if you'd like. And thank you to Bill Scott, such a beautiful transformative performance of words and tone and color. And Suzanne Austin Hill. Yes, in December, I will invite people to also share your work as a part of kind of integrated open mic series. So I will be performing my own work and inviting other people to share their responses to the sessions as well. And thank you, Suzanne, for seeking knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. I'm doing that as well, and I hope you all are as well. And if there aren't any more comments or responses, I will leave you all with that. And thank you so much for joining me tonight. And I hope to see you all next time.
Thank you all so much. Take care, everyone. I'm gonna end the meeting now. Bye.
Bye.